Have you ever wondered what life was like for slaves in ancient Rome? Slaves were a big part of Roman life. From the famous gladiators to the everyday workers, slaves shaped Rome's history. The stories were surprising and sometimes even sad. Some slaves became famous, while others lived very hard lives. But all of them had dreams and stories. So let's dive into their world. How did they live? What jobs did they do? And could they ever find freedom? Stick around to discover the hidden lives of slaves in Rome. Julius Caesar ruled for a short time from 81 to 41 BCE. He wanted more support in the Senate. To do this, he added new seats. This wasn't the first time it happened, but this time was different. The new men were from Gaul, which is now called France. Rome had just beaten them in a battle. We now know that the people of Gaul had a rich history, but it wasn't as advanced as the Romans at the time. The new senators from Gaul were amazed by Rome. The city was huge. They had never seen such buildings before. There were so many people and busy streets. The art and tools in Rome were like nothing else in the world. It felt like they were in a whole new world, but one thing was clear to them. Rome had many slaves. Some were even from Gaul, taken in wars. Could Rome be built without these slaves? Maybe. But having slaves was common in old Rome and many other places back then. The Romans, like many others who had slaves, could be very harsh. A lot of people in Rome were slaves. In fact, when Caesar came to power, about 20 to 30% of people in Rome and Italy were slaves. In Rome, there might have been even more slaves. The city was always growing. People needed help with work, services, teaching, and other needs. Sadly, this also included forced relations. Slaves did many jobs for the Romans, and just like in Roman society, there were different levels among the slaves. Some of the top slaves in Rome were smart advisors. Many of them were Greeks. Romans saw the Greeks as very cultured until they defeated them. Even with their skills, many Greek tutors remained slaves, but they might have lived a bit better. Having a Greek tutor was like a badge of honor for rich Romans. After the advisors, there were the house slaves. They were servers, cooks, and cleaners. If a Roman could buy a slave, they did. Having a slave showed you were well off. Lower down, but not at the very bottom, were the hard workers. They worked in big farms, stone pits, mines, and wetlands. Life was tough for these slaves. They often lived short, hard lives. How they were treated varied. Some owners, maybe a family or one person, could be a bit kinder, but many slaves were owned by big companies or rich groups. Some of these might treat their slaves a bit better. The hardest life for a slave was being a galley slave or working in the mines. Galley slaves rowed Roman ships. They were often chained to their seats. They stayed there in all weather. If there was danger or loss in battle, they were left behind. Working in the mines was very tough. Think about this. Rome used a lot of lead, but they didn't know about lead poisoning and how bad it was. The main thing about slaves was that they weren't free. If they tried to run away and got caught, they faced punishment. This punishment was often quick and could be very harsh or even deadly. But there was one group of slaves that got some respect in Rome, the gladiators. Some of them became famous as today's top music stars. Some gladiators who survived many fights were set free. They often had their own share of slaves or even other gladiators. There were also slaves who were talented actors or singers. They traveled around Italy and performed for people. They were always watched by their owners. Some of them were really famous and had special treatment, but even if they were popular, they weren't free. Most slaves dreamt of freedom, but many never got it. Some had been slaves since they were kids. They were captured in wars or born to slave mothers. Many didn't know what freedom felt like. When there were slave uprisings, some didn't even know what they were fighting for. Many slaves chose to stay in Rome rather than risk escaping. They feared the harsh punishments if caught. One of the most feared punishments in Rome was crucifixion. The word crucifixion comes from the Latin word crucificare, which means to fasten to a cross. The most famous person crucified was obviously Jesus. Back then, he was called the King of the Jews. The Romans didn't like this title because they had taken over Israel. But Jesus' story didn't end with his death on the cross. Many people were crucified by the Romans during their rule over Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. Crucifixion wasn't just a Roman punishment, but because of Jesus' death, many people link it with Rome. The word excruciating even has the same Latin root as crucify. Crucifixion was a slow and painful death. Many couldn't breathe properly because of gravity and would drown in their own fluids. Others died from the harsh weather or just from the pain and shock. Before being nailed to the cross, many were treated very badly. Slaves faced many dangers. They could be punished for trying to escape, plotting a revolt, or just making their owners unhappy. Sometimes, other slaves were made to punish them. They were given more power to keep the other slaves under control. Some slaves faced terrible deaths like being beaten or whipped. In Africa, some were even killed by elephants. The Colosseum in Rome is famous for its gladiator fights, but Rome wasn't the only city with a Colosseum. Many cities in the Roman Empire had their own arenas called colosseums or amphitheaters. There's a well-preserved one in Nîmes, France. These places hosted fights, but also executions. What's even scarier is that some executions were done as a form of entertainment for the crowds. Many slaves faced harsh punishments in the arenas. Some of these slaves were accused of rebelling or being Christians before Christianity was accepted in Rome. Often, they would act out Roman battles for entertainment. It's true that many were thrown to wild animals like lions, tigers, or even bears. Some were even trampled by large animals like elephants. The Romans were creative with their punishments. They sometimes wrapped people in material, set them on fire, and then watched. What's hard to imagine is that there were crowds actually cheering during these events. Roman slave owners could be very tough, but they also knew something important. People work better when they're treated well and with respect. If not, they might rebel against harsh treatment. Even the kindest Roman slave owners sometimes used force to make their slaves work. They were always on guard for revolt and acted quickly to stop them, but some owners were better to their slaves, so revolts in these places were rare, but still, there were exceptions. The most famous revolt was from 73 to 71 BCE. A gladiator named Spartacus led it. He and some others escaped and went south, aiming for Sicily. This place had seen 2 revolts in the last 100 years. Historians don't just call it a revolt, they call it the Third Servile War because it was like a war. Spartacus died fighting though, but many of his group didn't. Around 6,000 were crucified near Rome's main road, the Appian Way. Another sad part of history is sexual slavery. In ancient Rome, many slaves came from wars. Others were sold by neighboring regions, especially from Africa and the Middle East. But if you were wealthy and had many slaves, why buy more? Some people just had slaves give birth to more. It's hard to believe it, but they actually did this. Some women and girls became pregnant on purpose. This way, there were always more slaves being born. Money played a big role in another area too, prostitution. Rome was known for its brothels, yet not everyone working here was a slave. Some served only the rich and had a lot of power. Not just women, but young men too. Before Christianity, Rome didn't see any issue with this. Many people think slaves never got free, but some actually did, which is usually those who are close to their rich owners. Sometimes, an owner would free a slave in their will, or if the slave did something big, like saving their life. But even if they got free, becoming a Roman citizen was tough. Only some men, after serving in the army for years, got this chance. In conclusion, Rome's majesty was built by slaves who faced hard lives. While some gained fame or freedom, many faced brutal punishments and challenges. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget to leave a comment down below and let us know what you thought about this topic. See you next time, and bye for now.